Well, let's spend a few hours on an early winter afternoon here. I'm on the Patchogue Trail, which runs through the Patchogue State Forest here in New London County, Connecticut, right near the Rhode Island border. And we're going to be jumping across that border several times today on a hike that will take us to some wetlands where a fairly common tree in this area grows, and that is called the Atlantic White Cedar. It has a peculiar geographic range that runs from southern Maine all the way down to the Gulf Coast, but doesn't get too far from the ocean. Usually within 2 counties of the Atlantic Ocean or Gulf of Mexico is where you find the Atlantic White Cedar growing in wetland environments mostly. And it's often in what's called the coastal plain, which is an area of flat land with sand and gravel deposits that follow the Atlantic shore. But in much of New England, there is no coastal plain. Maine and parts of Connecticut, the bedrock hills go right down to the Atlantic coast, and there is no sand deposits. In Rhode Island and southeast Massachusetts, we do have a coastal plain, but what we're in today is bedrock hills here. We're about 20 miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean, and the Atlantic White Cedar is common in some of the bogs and swamps of this area. But leading right up to them, in this park especially, are these bedrock hills with boulders and ledges and even some views. So this is the Patchogue Trail that is a through trail that goes through this area. We'll get out the map later on and study where we've been. This is a hike that people could do if they want to find these trees. Often the trail goes either near the wetlands that these trees grow in or right through them on boardwalks and places. So a lot of people can hike their whole lives in the Appalachian Mountains, Ohio Valley, Lower Great Lakes and not see Atlantic White Cedar. But if you come to eastern or southeastern New England, there's many opportunities to see it. It was a tree that was logged heavily in earlier days. It was used for fence posts and for making shingles, and is very rot resistant, just like the northern white cedar and some of the western varieties, as well as the eastern red cedar. We're going to follow this bedrock ledge here, and eventually we got to drop off this ledge down to a wetland that's just a little bit out of view from here. Showed up clearly on the satellite view, and that's how I found it a few weeks ago, with the Atlantic White Cedar growing in abundance. Meanwhile, these are open ledges with lots of pitch pine and some bare oak growing up here. And I did some work with bare oak a few months ago, and there's a bunch of it growing right here in its tangled, gnarled form. And for those that like to eat wild foods, I'm not a big wild food teacher. It's not something I'm an expert on, but some of the common ones I know well. And right between this reindeer lichen, which you'd have to look up on the edibility of. I've heard that it is. Between these patches of reindeer lichen that are forming the soil on this ledge, we've got all kinds of winter green, which is the common name for this ground cover plant that's evergreen. So it's green in the winter and has these beautiful little red berries that are quite tasty. They taste like a wintergreen lifesaver. And on these open rock areas, this plant is very common, and the berries are around until somebody eats them. They don't really decay. In the wintertime, they have a waxy coating that helps them stay intact through the winter months. Let's continue on. And we haven't come more than a couple hundred feet from the Patchogue Trail here. We're down in the thickets that lead to this cedar swamp here. So we still have that bedrock ledge just behind me here. We'll zoom out. and take a look at what's on the other side here. So we've had oaks come right down to the edge of this swamp. We got a scarlet oak here. We got some white oak. Plenty of chestnut oak around here. And just behind me, the woods get dense and dark and almost spooky. We've got some white pine growing right up to the edge of this swamp. And there's a few hummocks back here where the white pine have actually managed to make it. They don't like getting their feet too wet or their roots too wet, but you know what? Trees will grow wherever the seeds land if they can, and they don't read the textbook. They do what works for them at the time. And here's the edge of our Atlantic White Cedar swamp, and boy, you know, you could just tell how much darker and cooler it is here. We've had scant snowfall this winter. Just a ½ inch here and a ½ inch there, and it's in the 40s today. But not in this swamp here. Much cooler as you walk down here, and almost no sun getting through. And the bedrock comes right down to here. I actually have to climb off a ledge here to get to this depression. Let's stop for just a minute and take a better look. And we'll zoom in at the partly cloudy skies in the oak forest that we hiked through to get here. And then we're going to zoom around. We did a little hummock hopping here to get out into the cedar forest. The good news is that these Atlantic White Cedars do not actually grow underwater. They have to grow on these hummocks to survive. And if the water table gets too high, they actually die. I've seen that happen around here. When I was doing some hikes a few weeks ago, I thought that I remembered seeing Atlantic White Cedar, and I had in past years. But since then, the beavers have dammed up the wetlands and increased the water level, and the Atlantic White Cedar was all dead. So I was scratching my head looking at satellite views, trying to find more stands of Atlantic White Cedar to record for this channel. And there are some very well-known Atlantic White Cedar stands around here that actually have very good access, and I can use those for this channel, and I probably will, but I like to make an adventure out of it as well. So you can see how much darker it is back here. And this is almost entirely Atlantic White Cedar growing in this wetland here, and they grow close together, and they almost bump elbows. They grow straight and really don't get much foliage, at least in the middle of this cedar swamp, until they get up 40, 50, 60 feet. And then they get their foliage. One of the access roads around here is at the edge of this same cedar swamp, where we can study the foliage at ground level and some of the cones as well. And while we're on the hummocks here in this cedar swamp, let's take a close look at the bark of this Atlantic White Cedar tree. It's not as fuzzy and frayed as the eastern red cedar, which can often grow near these cedar swamps, these Atlantic White Cedar swamps. If there's any open land that's suitable, old farmland, you can often find eastern red cedar growing, almost bumping elbows with this. In this park, I'm not seeing that. But it's not as frayed or fuzzy as that of the eastern red cedar, but probably a little bit more frayed or shaggy than that of the northern white cedar, which grows in New England as well. I'm not aware of a place where both grow right next to each other. Part of the reason for that is the habitat requirements. This sphagnum moss, which creates a very acid bog type wetland, is what you often find growing on these hummocks. And the northern white cedar that I recorded last year for this channel was actually growing on a limestone ledge or a dolomite ledge in Ohio. And it does grow in New England, and its tolerance of highly acid environments is less than that of the Atlantic White Cedar. So I don't think you would have a problem confusing them, because I would doubt that they would actually grow in the same wetland. But the pattern and the furrows of this Atlantic white cedar is very similar to that of the northern white cedar, and they both have white heartwood. The smaller Atlantic white cedar trees that have perished in this wetland for lack of sunlight, the smaller ones have died back. I was able to break one open just now, and there's the heartwood. Light tan, almost white in color. And the heartwood of an eastern red cedar I've got right here has that purplish hue. Once the branch gets more than a ½ inch around, the purplish hue shows up in the heartwood. And if you cut down one of these eastern red cedar trees, the center of the tree is a bright purple, almost magenta color. So this is a cedar bog or a cedar swamp. Again, the trees have to grow on these hummocks to survive. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, if the beavers or any other type of activity were to raise the water level consistently higher than it is, these trees would perish and would become more of an open wetland. And in that very densely shaded cedar swamp a few minutes ago, there was no chance of finding the foliage of those trees in view. They were shading each other out, and they had no lower branches that were still alive. I've come to a more open area along the edge of the same cedar swamp where they created an access road to the Green Falls Pond recreation area with some picnic areas and a primitive campground. No running water, but they do have hydrants where you can get water for your campsite. Nice place to camp. And fortunately, the construction of this access road did not raise the water level of this cedar swamp and drowned out these trees. Got one right here. Again, it's getting enough sun on along this road here that it does have foliage at ground level here. And right up to the sky. I can say that the foliage of this Atlantic white cedar resembles the eastern red cedar more than it does the northern white cedar. But it is not identical to either one of those. And I've got all three with me in my pack. We can study them up close in a few minutes here, but I just want to show you. This is what it looks like. There's my thumb for scale. The plates are somewhat flat on this, but they're much narrower than that of the northern white cedar. And it sprays off in a nice, elegant pattern. But it's not quite as bushy looking as the foliage of that of the eastern red cedar. And it gets plenty of cones. The cones aren't too terribly big. They're a little smaller than those of the northern white cedar. But they do resemble the northern white cedar in the cones. They do not look like the blueberry like cones of the eastern red cedar. Again, I've got those in my pack. We'll do a comparison in a few minutes here, but I just want to look at these in their natural setting here. These trees are covered with hundreds of cones. Again, they're about the size of a pea, maybe about the size of a kernel of corn, and that's about it. And I've got another branch here with the cones a little closer to ground level for us to study on this Atlantic white cedar. Those are about the size of a kernel of corn. And an even brown in color. The guidebook says they're more blue during the growing season. This is the end of the growing season, and they're starting to open up. They definitely look different than those of the northern white cedar. And again, we'll do a side-by-side comparison shortly here. I'm just trying to look at them in their natural habitat here. Growing right on the branches. So there they are right there. But these larger trees, if you look up beyond the view of this camera, there's hundreds of them on the ends of the branches. And again, I'm not finding them on the ground, but they're kind of inconspicuous, so they might be on the ground and just not easy to see because of all the pine needles and mosses growing in this same area. And if a person had the whole day to hike in this area, the Patchogue Trail that I recorded a few minutes ago connects with what's called the Narragansett Trail. And about 8 or 9 miles from that cedar swamp along the Patchogue Trail, we come to the Long and L Ponds natural area here just across the border in Rhode Island. If you want to learn plants that are tolerant and like acid soils, this is a great place to come. Because not only have we got our Atlantic White Cedar growing in this wetland, reaching towards the sky, we've got an Appalachian plant that is not common in New England. There are some patches of it around here. But this is one of the larger patches of great rhododendron or Rhododendron maximum in New England. And it's mostly in these lowlands between these bedrock ledges. And we've also got some mountain laurel growing back here and some eastern hemlock. So this is a really neat place to learn all, there's all kinds of, there's carnivorous plants back here. This Long and L Ponds has been a national natural landmark for many years for that reason. And the hiking is not easy. There's a lot of scrambling around and over boulders, but we're going to take another look at some Atlantic White Cedar as we hike today on this section of the Narragansett Trail. Again, this all could be done in one day if you had the time. I didn't want to take the time and not have time to make videos. But this depression between this ledge and the next ledge is full of great rhododendron with these large leaves. Which blooms in midsummer, early to midsummer, and then all kinds of Atlantic White Cedar as well. So that's a fascinating place to learn our plants, and we'll keep working on this Atlantic White Cedar and do a little more comparing to the other cedars that I put on this channel as we hike today. And let's just enjoy some of this incredible scenery back here. I mean, this Rhododendron maximum is common in the central and southern Appalachians. And if you didn't know better, that's where you think you are today. And certainly makes for a lot of green appearance during the middle of winter. This is late December, so not gray and brown like we often see in the hardwood forest, but all different shades of green back here today. And sandwiched between the many ledges at the Long and L Pond natural area here, we do have a lowland with Atlantic White Cedar. I got a boardwalk here. There's an outlet to L Pond that leads to Long Pond, and then that pond drains to the east. And this would be at the southeast corner of this map here. And it shows the names of those ponds, and the solid blue line is what's called the Narragansett Trail. And it connects with what's called the Patchogue Trail. And right about here where I've got that black circle with the star next to it are the swamp deposits indicated in purple, where I did the first set of videos on the Atlantic White Cedar this morning. We've come about 8 or 9 miles southeast of there. I drove down here on surface roads so I wouldn't have to spend the whole day hiking. And there are extensive purple indicated swamp deposits around the L Pond and Long Pond. And those swamp deposits are full of Atlantic White Cedar, as well as some very unusual plants as well. Got some pretty large Atlantic White Cedars growing right here up by the boardwalk. Let's take a look at them. From what I've read, these trees are very slow growing and can grow for hundreds of years if given the opportunity. This guy right here is about 1.5 feet in diameter. And again, that bark is just a little bit more frayed than similarly sized northern white cedars. Got a couple right back here we'll look at. And this one here is probably 2 feet in diameter. Without coring tools, I would have no way of knowing how old this tree is. But I can probably say that this land would have been unappealing to anybody that wanted to either farm or log because of the steep rock bluffs on both sides of this valley. So these trees may be quite old. And as you can see in this video, that we don't need a swamp with dense cedar trees and trees growing elbow to elbow to find Atlantic White Cedar. It's growing along the edge of this natural pond here, along the Narragansett Trail in Rhode Island, and actually creeps out onto the boggy area surrounding this pond. So that's where it gets enough sun for the cones to actually germinate and perpetuate the species. In that swamp forest where I recorded this morning, not enough sun was getting through for anything really to grow. It would take a clearing of some type from an ice storm or windstorm for the Atlantic White Cedar or any other tree to start growing in there. But this is a natural pond here along the Narragansett Trail, and there's some interesting rock bluffs just right up the trail here. We can get a nice view of the ponds in this area and put the wraps on today's lesson. And from the tops of these ledges on Long Pond, which is about 1/2 mile long, we can get a great view and put the wraps on this lesson. I've got in front of me here is all 3 cedars that I've put on this channel, including the Atlantic White Cedar that is this video here. Got a US currency dime for scale. In the center of your screen, to its left, is northern white cedar. This is from a planted specimen, but it's very closely related to the ones that I filmed in Ohio last year. And the cones are a similar size and a similar shape to the natural specimen. So those cones are a little bigger than a kernel of corn, I would say. And the cones just above it are from this Atlantic White Cedar. And the foliage on this northern white cedar is obvious plates that are flat stitched together. And the foliage on this Atlantic White Cedar are little plates stitched together, but they're much smaller, much narrower. And just for comparison, the foliage of the eastern red cedar comes out from the branch in all directions, and that of the Atlantic White Cedar and the northern white cedar tend to come out in one plane only and spread out in a very elegant fashion. I also do have the seed cones from this eastern red cedar that tend to have either a greenish gray or a blue color this time of year. This is in early winter. This is our study of the Atlantic White Cedar. It's common along the Atlantic coast in wetlands and swamps. It's common in the Great Dismal Swamp. It's common in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey in the wetter areas. And it's common in along these bedrock ledges, in the depressions between these bedrock ledges in southeast New England, and also in the sand deposits and the depressions in the sand deposits of Massachusetts and Rhode Island.